Some men build walls around their hearts so high they forget what warmth feels like. Jonas Reed was one of them, a solitary mountain man living alone in a weathered Wyoming cabin, haunted by war and ghosts only he could see. One cold evening, a desperate widow named Martha Lane and her daughter Clara arrived at his door, exhausted and hungry. Their wagon had broken down miles back, everything stolen by bandits. When Martha asked, "Can we stay tonight?" Jonas saw Clara's trembling hands and stepped aside. "There's warmth enough for all, ma'am." Over the following days, something unexpected happened. Laughter returned to that lonely cabin. Martha insisted on helping with chores. Clara mended his roof. And slowly, the man who'd chosen solitude found himself hoping they'd never leave. But when those same outlaws came hunting through the valley, would Jonas fight for this newfound family or retreat back into the shadows he knew so well? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming frontier was a land that didn't forgive weakness. It tested every soul who dared to carve out a life from its rocky soil and unforgiving winters. High in the foothills, where the pine trees grew thick and the wind carried the scent of snow even in summer, Jonas Reed had built his existence one careful stone at a time. His cabin sat in a small valley, sheltered on three sides by rising slopes covered in lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. A creek ran 40 yards from his door, its water cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. He'd chosen this spot 12 years ago for its isolation as much as its resources. A man could disappear here. A man could forget. The cabin itself was solid work, built from logs Jonas had felled and shaped himself. Chinked with clay and moss, the walls kept out the worst of the winter cold. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising straight and true. The roof was shake shingle, replaced section by section each summer. 2 small windows shuttered against storms. A heavy door with iron hinges he'd forged himself. Everything made to last, built for permanence, even though Jonas had stopped believing in permanent things. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A rope bed in one corner, with a straw mattress and wool blankets. A table he'd hewn from a single plank of pine. 2 chairs, though he'd only ever needed one. Shelves holding supplies, flour, beans, coffee, salt. Traps and tools hanging from pegs. A rifle over the door. Everything in its place. Everything serving a purpose. Jonas himself was a man the mountains had shaped. 42 years old, though he looked older. His face was weathered leather, lined deep around the eyes and mouth. His hair, once dark, had gone grey at the temples. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked hard and fought harder. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and strong in the way of men who lived physical lives. His eyes were what people remembered, the few who saw them, pale blue like ice on a winter lake and just as cold. He'd been a soldier once. The war between the states had taken 4 years of his life and left him with memories he'd spent the last 17 years trying to outrun. He didn't speak of it, didn't think of it if he could help it. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he'd wake with the taste of smoke in his mouth and the sound of cannon fire echoing in his ears. After the war, he'd tried to return to normal life. Married Elizabeth, a gentlewoman with kind eyes and a patient heart. They'd had a son, Samuel. For 3 years, Jonas had known what it meant to be happy. Then the fever came. First Samuel, then Elizabeth. Within a week, they were both gone, buried in a cemetery in Missouri that Jonas had never visited again. He'd drifted west after that, worked cattle drives, hired his gun a few times, trapped fur in the high country. Eventually, he'd found this valley and decided to stop moving. He built the cabin with his own hands, every log a meditation, every nail a prayer for numbness. He learned to live with silence, learned to prefer it. His days followed a rhythm as regular as the seasons. Wake before dawn, check the traps, tend the small garden patch where he grew potatoes, onions, carrots, hunt when meat ran low, fish the creek when the trout were running, chop wood, mend tools. In winter he'd hunker down with his stores, venture out only when necessary. In summer, he'd make the 3-day ride to the nearest town for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. He spoke to no one unless he had to. The few trappers or prospectors who passed through knew him as a man who valued his privacy. They'd wave from a distance, and Jonas would nod back, but that was the extent of it. He'd earned a reputation, Jonas Reed, the hermit of Blackfoot Valley. Left alone, he left others alone. That suited everyone just fine. The mountains spoke to him in ways people no longer could. The wind in the pines, the cry of an eagle, the rush of the creek, these were the voices he understood. They asked nothing of him, expected nothing. They simply were, and so was he. On the evening Martha Lane and her daughter arrived, Jonas had been checking his trapline. October had turned cold early that year, and he'd been laying in extra meat for the winter. 3 rabbits hung from his belt, and he was thinking about the stew he'd make. The same stew he'd made 100 times before. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Long shadows stretched across the valley floor. Jonas was maybe a quarter-mile from his cabin when he saw the smoke from his chimney and stopped dead. He hadn't lit a fire. His hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt. His eyes scanned the tree line, the approaches to his cabin. No horses visible, but that didn't mean anything. His mind calculated possibilities, threats, responses. Old instincts, soldier instincts, rising up despite the years. He moved forward carefully, using the cover of the pines, circling to approach from an angle that would give him a clear view. The rabbits he left behind, they'd only slow him down. His breathing steadied, his body remembering rhythms of stealth it had learned in a different life. Then he saw them, 2 women, standing beside a broken wagon maybe 50 yards from his cabin. The wagon's front wheel was shattered, the axle cracked. Their horse was gone, stolen or run off, he couldn't tell. They'd managed to drag some supplies to his porch. A trunk, a few bundles wrapped in canvas. The older woman stood with her back straight despite obvious exhaustion. She wore a dark dress, travel-stained and torn at the hem. Her hair, more grey than brown, was pulled back in a bun that had mostly come loose. She held herself with a kind of dignity that poverty and hardship hadn't quite broken. The younger one, barely out of girlhood, sat on the porch steps with her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook, crying or just exhausted, Jonas couldn't tell. Her dress was in worse shape than her mother's, and her hands, when she lifted them, were scraped and bleeding. Jonas stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. Every instinct told him to wait for them to leave, to stay hidden until they moved on. This was his place, his solitude, his carefully constructed peace. But even as he thought it, he saw the younger one, Clara, though he didn't know her name yet, look up. Her face was pale, streaked with tears and dirt. Her eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, and her hands, clutching at her mother's shawl, were trembling. Jonas stepped out of the trees. Both women started, the older one moving instinctively to put herself between Jonas and her daughter. Her chin lifted, and despite everything there was no begging in her eyes. Just a quiet, desperate courage. "Please," she said, her voice steady, though Jonas could hear the effort it cost her. "We don't mean to trespass. Our wagon broke. We've been robbed. We have nowhere else to go." She paused, swallowed hard, then asked the question that would change everything. "Can we stay tonight?" "Just tonight. We'll be gone in the morning." Jonas looked at her, looked at the daughter, with the trembling hands and the fear in her eyes, looked at the broken wagon and the pitiful pile of salvaged belongings. He thought about saying no, thought about the life he'd built here, the walls he'd erected, the peace he'd earned through isolation. Then he thought about Elizabeth, about what she would say if she could see him now. He stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "There's warmth enough for all, ma'am," he said quietly. "Come inside." The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting warm light across the cabin's interior. Martha Lane sat in one of Jonas's chairs, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Her daughter Clara had finally stopped shaking and sat on the floor near the hearth, closer to the warmth. Jonas had given them water first, then coffee. He'd started a pot of stew with the rabbits, added potatoes and wild onions from his stores. The smell filled the small space, and he'd seen both women's eyes follow the pot with an hunger they tried to hide. We'll pay you back, Martha said, breaking the silence that had settled over them. For your kindness. For the food and shelter. Jonas stirred the stew, his back to them. No need. There is, Martha insisted, and there was steel beneath her exhaustion. We're not beggars, Mr. Reed, Jonas Reed. He turned to face her. And I didn't figure you for beggars, ma'am. But you're in need, and I've got what you need. That's the end of it. Martha studied him with eyes that had seen too much but hadn't given up. My name is Martha Lane. This is my daughter, Clara. She paused, then added, We're widows, both of us now, I suppose. My husband died 8 months ago in a mining accident outside of Laramie. Clara lost her husband to pneumonia the winter before that. Jonas nodded slowly. Widows. He understood that particular grief, the weight of it, the way it changed the shape of your days. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and handed them to the women. Eat first. Talk later if you want to. They ate like people who hadn't had a proper meal in days, trying to maintain dignity but unable to completely hide their hunger. Jonas ate standing up, leaning against the wall, watching them without seeming to watch. Old habits. Always know who's in your space, what they're capable of, what they need. Clara finished first and looked up at him with brown eyes that reminded him of a deer, cautious but curious. Thank you, she said softly. We didn't know if anyone lived here. We saw the smoke from the chimney and hoped... She stopped, looked down at her empty bowl. We hoped for kindness, Martha finished, and found it. That's more than we've had these past weeks. Jonas refilled their bowls without comment, then poured more coffee. The cabin felt smaller with people in it, but not in a bad way. Just different. Like a room that had forgotten its purpose, suddenly remembering. Your wagon, he said finally. Wheels broken clean through, axle too. Not a quick fix, Martha nodded. We know. We tried to... She stopped, her composure cracking slightly. We've been managing on our own since Thomas died. The homestead went to the bank. We packed what we could, bought a wagon and horse with what little money we had left. Clara has an aunt in Sheridan, owns a boarding house. She wrote that there'd be work for us there, a place to stay. Long way to Sheridan, Jonas observed. Yes. Martha's hands tightened around her cup. We were making fair progress until 3 days ago. Her voice went flat, the way voices do when recounting trauma. 3 men. They came into our camp just after dawn. We were hitching the horse when they rode up. Clara's shoulders tensed at the memory. Martha reached over and took her daughter's hand. The one in charge, he had a scar right here. Martha touched her own cheek, drawing a line from temple to jaw. Called himself Cutler. He was polite at first, asked where we were headed, if we'd seen any other travelers. Then he noticed our trunk, our supplies. They took everything, Clara whispered. The money we'd saved, the silver spoons that were my grandmother's, all our food except what we'd hidden in the wagon bed. They took our horse, her voice broke. Papa's watch, the only thing I had left of him, and they... Martha pulled her daughter close. Cutler said we should be grateful they were gentlemen, that they'd leave us the wagon and our lives. Then they rode off laughing. Jonas's jaw tightened. He knew the name Cutler. Everyone in the territory knew it or should. Silas Cutler ran a gang of outlaws that had been terrorizing the frontier settlements for the better part of 2 years. Robbery, horse theft, the occasional murder. The law wanted him. But the law was spread thin in Wyoming territory, and Cutler knew every bolt hole and back trail in the mountains. This Cutler, Jonas said carefully. Big man, dark beard, rides a paint horse. Martha looked up sharply. You know him? Know of him. Everybody does. Jonas moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside slightly, looked out at the darkening valley. He's got a reputation, not a good one. We walked for 2 days after that, Martha continued, following the trail, hoping to reach some settlement. The wagon wheel gave out yesterday. We tried to fix it, but she gestured helplessly. We're not carpenters. Then we saw your cabin, saw the smoke. I thought, maybe there's someone who can help, or at least, her voice softened, at least a place to rest before we have to keep moving. Jonas turned back to them. In the firelight, they looked small and vulnerable, but there was something else, too. A strength that hadn't broken despite everything. Martha's straight back, the way she met his eyes directly. Clara's quiet courage in the face of loss and fear. You can stay, he said. Long as you need to. Until it's safe to travel. Until we can get word to your aunt or fix that wagon proper." Martha's eyes shimmered with sudden tears, though she didn't let them fall. "Mr. Reed, Jonas," he corrected gently. "Jonas then. We can't impose on you like that. You don't know us. We could be. You're two women alone in the wilderness who've been robbed and left with nothing," Jonas interrupted. "I know enough." He paused, then added, "I've got room. I've got supplies. Winter's coming, and you won't make it to Sheridan before the snows hit, not on foot, not without proper gear." "Then let us earn our keep," Martha said firmly. "I can cook, clean, mend. Clara's good with her hands, good with repairs. We won't be charity cases." Jonas saw the pride in her face, the same pride he'd carried all these years. The need to feel useful, to not be a burden. He understood it down to his bones. "All right," he agreed. "You help with what needs doing, and we'll call it square." Martha stood, extended her hand. When Jonas took it, her grip was firm, her palm calloused from work. "Thank you," she said simply. "You may have saved our lives," Jonas shook his head. "Just doing what's right, ma'am." "Martha," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "And doing what's right is rarer than it should be. Especially out here." That night Jonas gave up his bed to the women and made himself a pallet on the floor near the fire. He lay awake long after they'd fallen asleep, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing, the crackle of the fire, the wind moving through the pines outside. He thought about Cutler and his gang. Thought about men like that, men who took what they wanted and left devastation in their wake. He'd known plenty of them during the war and after. Violence came easy to some people, easier than kindness, but he also thought about Martha's hand in his, the firmness of her grip, about Clara's brown eyes and the fear slowly leaving them as the warmth of the fire and a full belly did their work, about the way the cabin felt different with voices in it, with people who needed shelter and found it here. He touched the worn wooden box beneath his makeshift pillow, the one that held his war medal and other things he'd tried to forget. Part of him wanted to open it, to look at the tarnished silver and remember the man he'd been, the soldier, the fighter. But another part of him, a part that was just beginning to wake after years of sleep, thought maybe there were other ways to be, other purposes besides surviving alone. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled. Jonas listened until the sound faded, then closed his eyes. Tomorrow he'd check the wagon, see what could be salvaged. He'd teach them the land, the dangers. He'd keep them safe until they could move on. And if a voice in the back of his mind whispered that he didn't want them to move on, that the cabin felt less empty with them in it, well, he'd deal with that when the time came. For now, there was warmth enough for all. The days took on a rhythm. Jonas woke early, tended to his trap lines, chopped wood for the coming winter. Martha cooked and cleaned, mended clothes, organized supplies, with an efficiency that spoke of years managing a household. Clara helped wherever she was needed, her quiet competence a constant surprise. One morning Jonas found Martha standing by the cabin's corner, running her fingers over a stone set into the foundation. It was different from the others, deliberately shaped and carved with initials, J.R. and E.R. "Your wife?" Martha asked softly when she noticed him watching. Jonas nodded. "Elizabeth. I carved it when I finished building. Thought we'd grow old here together. What was she like?" The question caught him off guard. No one had asked about Elizabeth in years. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to speak her name aloud to another person. "Kind," he said finally. "Patient. She could find good in just about anybody. Used to say I saw the world too hard, that there was more to life than just surviving." Martha traced the initials with gentle fingers. "She sounds wise." She was. Jonas paused, then added, "Lost her to fever. Her and our boy Samuel. He was 3 years old." "Oh, Jonas." Martha's voice carried the weight of understanding that only comes from personal loss. "I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago. Time doesn't heal everything," Martha said quietly. "Sometimes it just teaches us how to carry it better." Jonas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who understood grief not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. Someone who'd walked through that same dark valley and come out the other side still able to smile, still able to hope. "Your husband," he said. "Tell me about him." Martha's expression softened. "Thomas, he was a dreamer. Always believed the next opportunity would be the one that changed everything. That's why we ended up in Laramie, at that mine. He was sure there was silver there, enough to buy land, build a real home." She smiled sadly. "He died believing it. The mine collapsed before they ever found more than trace amounts. I'm sorry for your loss too." "We had good years," Martha said. "Not enough of them, but good ones. He loved Clara like she was his own daughter. After her husband died, Thomas insisted she come back home, said family sticks together. He was right about that, at least." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people who'd loved and lost, standing beside a stone that marked both a beginning and an ending. "I want to show you something," Jonas said suddenly. He went into the cabin and returned with a small wooden box. Opening it, he revealed a tarnished silver medal, a few letters tied with ribbon, and a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. "That's them," he said. "Elizabeth and Samuel." Martha looked at the photograph with tender care. "They were beautiful. I haven't looked at this in years," Jonas admitted. "Thought it was easier not to remember. But maybe your Elizabeth was right. Maybe I've been seeing things too hard, or maybe you were doing what you needed to survive," Martha said gently. "There's no wrong way to grieve, Jonas. We all do the best we can." She handed the photograph back, and their fingers touched briefly. Neither of them pulled away immediately. The moment stretched, full of unspoken understanding and something else, something neither was quite ready to name. "I should get back to work," Jonas said finally, clearing his throat. "And I should start dinner," Martha smiled. "But thank you for sharing them with me." That afternoon, Clara asked Jonas to help her with the small plot of earth beside the cabin. The ground was cold but not yet frozen, and she had seeds from the wagon she wanted to plant. "It's late in the season," Jonas warned. "Most won't have time to grow before winter." "I know," Clara said, kneeling in the dirt. "But some might. And even if they don't, they'll be there in the spring, won't they? Seeds don't die just because winter comes." Jonas knelt beside her, showed her how to prepare the soil, how deep to plant. As they worked, Clara talked about her husband, about the small farm they'd tried to start before he got sick. "We planted a garden together our first spring," she said. "He said every growing thing was an act of faith. You put something in the ground not knowing if it'll survive but hoping it will." Sounds like he was a philosopher. Clara laughed. He'd have liked that. He was actually a clerk, worked at the general store, but he thought deep thoughts. She paused, pressing seeds into the earth with careful fingers. "Mama worries about me. Thinks I'm not healing right because I don't cry much. Everyone grieves different. That's what I tell her." Clara sat back on her heels, looked at the planted rows. "Truth is, I'm grateful for the time we had. It wasn't long, but it was real. Some people never get that." Jonas thought about his own brief years of happiness, about how he'd spent so much time since then focused on what he'd lost rather than what he'd been given. "You're right," he said. "Some people never do." That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jonas noticed Martha had mended one of his old shirts. She'd replaced buttons, reinforced seams, even patched a tear at the elbow so neatly he could barely see where the damage had been. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I wanted to." Martha passed him a bowl of stew. "Besides, you're giving us shelter and food. The least I can do is make sure your clothes aren't falling apart." Clara grinned. "Mama can't sit still if there's mending to be done." "It's like a compulsion. Someone has to look after things," Martha said primly. But her eyes sparkled with humor. Jonas found himself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The cabin was full of life, full of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Martha's cooking smells, Clara's quiet humming as she sketched, the simple sounds of people existing together in shared space. That night, after the women had gone to bed, Jonas sat by the fire with Elizabeth's photograph. He looked at her young face, at the baby in her arms, and for the first time in years, the memory didn't just hurt. It also reminded him of what it felt like to be happy, To be part of something bigger than himself. I think you'd like them, he whispered to the photograph. Martha and Clara, I think you'd be glad they're here. The fire crackled, and somewhere outside an owl called. Jonas placed the photograph back in its box, but this time he set the box on the shelf instead of hiding it away. Some things he was beginning to understand were meant to be remembered, not as weights to carry, but as reminders of why life was worth living. The cabin was no longer just a shelter he'd built to hide from the world. It was becoming slowly and unexpectedly something else. It was becoming a home again. The next morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Jonas spent the early hours teaching Martha and Clara how to properly handle the rifle and his spare pistol. He set up targets against a hillside backdrop, old tin cans on fence posts, and showed them stance, aim, trigger control. Martha had a steadier hand than he expected. Thomas taught me basics, she explained after her third shot hit true. Said a woman on the frontier needed to protect herself. Clara was more tentative, but determined. By the end of the morning, she could at least hit the general area she was aiming for, which Jonas figured was good enough for defense. Remember, he told them as they walked back to the cabin, shooting at targets is different from shooting at a man. If it comes to that, you aim for center mass and you don't hesitate. A moment's doubt can cost you your life. You sound like a soldier, Martha observed. Jonas hadn't told them much about the war, about the things he'd done. I was, long time ago, and you've seen combat. Real combat, it wasn't a question. Jonas nodded. More than I care to remember. Martha stopped walking, turned to face him. Is that why you came out here? To get away from that? Partly, Jonas met her eyes. War does something to a man. Shows you what humans are capable of when the rules break down. After Elizabeth and Samuel died, I didn't see much point in being around people anymore. Figured I'd do less harm alone. You don't give yourself enough credit, Martha said softly. You took in 2 strangers when you could have turned us away. You've shared your home, your supplies, your time. That's not a man who does harm, Jonas. That's a good man. Jonas wanted to believe her, but the memories of the war ran deep. He'd done things he wasn't proud of, things that still woke him in the night sometimes. War makes you into something you're not. Takes pieces of your soul and doesn't give them back. Maybe, Martha acknowledged. But it doesn't have to define you. Thomas used to say every day is a chance to be better than you were yesterday. To choose kindness over bitterness. Your Thomas was a wise man. He'd have liked you, Martha smiled. Would have said you were exactly the kind of man he hoped Clara and I would find if we ever needed help. That afternoon, Martha showed Jonas her recipe box, a small tin decorated with faded flowers. Inside were cards written in various hands, recipes passed down through generations. My grandmother's bread recipe, Martha said, holding up one card with yellowed edges. My mother's stew. Even one from Thomas's mother given to me when we married. She touched each card, reverently. It's not much, but it's all I have left of them. The bandits took almost everything, but I'd hidden this in my underthings. They didn't search that thoroughly, thank God. Jonas watched as she prepared dinner, following one of the recipes, explaining the history of each ingredient and preparation. There was something deeply moving about it, this tangible connection to the past, to family, to the continuation of tradition, despite loss and hardship. My mother always said cooking was an act of love, Martha continued, stirring a pot. That feeding people was how you showed them they mattered. You're feeding us well, Jonas said. Better than I've eaten in years. Martha looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That's because you matter, Jonas. You and this place, and what we're building here, it all matters. Later, as Clara worked on another sketch, Jonas asked her about her plans for the future. Your mother said you have artistic talent. Ever think about doing something with it? Clara shrugged. People don't pay for drawings of landscapes and wildflowers. Besides, there's not much call for artists out here. Cities have art schools, Jonas pointed out. Galleries. I'm not city people. Clara's voice was firm. I belong out here, where the sky's big and the air's clean, where you can see for miles and hear yourself think. She paused, added quietly, "Besides, after my husband died, I realized I didn't want to be anywhere that reminded me of what I'd lost. I wanted to start fresh. Is that what this feels like?" Jonas asked. "Fresh?" Clara smiled. "It's starting to feel like home. Which is strange, considering we've only been here a few weeks." "Home's not always about time," Jonas said. "Sometimes it's about finding where you fit." That evening, as Jonas prepared for his trip to town, Martha helped him organize his supplies and list. She added items he wouldn't have thought of: needles, thread, certain spices. Practical things that made a home rather than just a shelter. "I'll be gone a week," he reminded her. "Maybe less if the weather holds." "We'll be fine," Martha assured him. "Clara and I have survived worse. I know you have." Jonas hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This is emergency money. I keep it hidden in the cabin, under the loose floorboard by the bed. If something happens, if you need to run, take it and go." Martha started to protest, but Jonas held up a hand. "I'm not saying anything will happen, just being practical. Like soldiers are," Martha said. But she took the pouch, memorized its location, before turning in for the night. Jonas sat on the porch, despite the cold, looking out at the valley, silvered by moonlight. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, witnesses to human drama, but unchanged by it. He'd always found comfort in that, the permanence of stone and sky, while human lives flickered and faded. But now he found himself thinking about impermanence differently, about how the brief, fragile nature of life made it precious rather than pointless. Martha's recipes, passed down through generations. Clara's drawings, capturing moments that would otherwise vanish. Even this cabin, built by hand against the certainty of decay, they were all acts of faith in something beyond mere survival. They were declarations that life mattered, even when it was hard. That connection mattered, even when it hurt. That love mattered, especially when it was temporary. Jonas touched the pocket watch in his vest, the one that had stopped the day Elizabeth died. He'd carried it for 12 years without winding it, a memorial to frozen time, to the moment his life had ended, even though his body kept moving. On impulse, he pulled it out and wound it. The familiar tick-tick-tick resumed, steady and certain. Time moving forward again, whether he was ready or not. Inside the cabin, he could hear Martha and Clara talking softly, their voices a gentle murmur. He could smell bread baking, see lamplight warm against the windows. All of it temporary, fragile, human, all of it worth protecting. He wound the watch one more time, set the hands to match the position of the moon, and tucked it back in his pocket. Over his heart, where it ticked out the seconds of a life that had started moving again, Jonas left for town before dawn, his mules packed with furs to trade and a list of supplies that would see them through winter. Martha and Clara stood on the porch to see him off, both bundled against the cold. 3 days there, 3 back, Jonas reminded them. "You stay alert, keep the rifle close. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know." "We'll be fine," Martha assured him, though her hand rested protectively on Clara's shoulder. "You be careful in town." Jonas nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. He crossed back to the porch, took Martha's hand briefly. "I'll hurry back. We'll be here," Martha said, and the promise in her words went deeper than just those 3 days. The ride to town was cold, but uneventful. Jonas made good time, his mules steady, and his mind occupied with thoughts of the women waiting in his cabin. It felt strange having people to return to. Strange and right in equal measure. The town of Broken Creek wasn't much, a collection of rough buildings along a single muddy street. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small hotel that doubled as a boarding house. Jonas conducted his business efficiently, trading his furs, purchasing supplies, posting Martha's letter to her aunt in Sheridan. It was in the saloon, while having a quick drink before starting back, that everything changed. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pike, who Jonas had known casually for years, leaned across the bar with a knowing look. "Heard you got visitors up your way, Reed." Jonas kept his expression neutral. "Word travels, always does." Pike wiped at a glass that didn't need wiping. "Fella came through last week asking questions. Wanted to know about properties in the high country, who lived where. whether anyone had seen two women traveling alone. Jonas's hand tightened on his glass.
What kind of fella?
The kind you don't want knocking on your door. Pike lowered his voice. Silas Cutler and 3 of his boys. They're holed up at the old Mackenzie mine. About 20 miles south of your valley. The news hit Jonas like a physical blow. Cutler, here, looking for Martha and Clara. They say what they wanted with 2 women? Pike shook his head. Just that they had unfinished business. But Cutler's been asking around about you, too. Seems someone told him about the hermit in Blackfoot Valley, and he's putting pieces together. Jonas finished his drink, his mind already racing through possibilities and plans. How long ago was this?
4 days.
Maybe 5. Pike gave him a serious look. You mixed up in something bad, Reed? Not by choice. Jonas stood, threw coins on the bar. Those women, they're under my protection. Cutler robbed them, left them for dead. I'm not letting him finish the job. Pike nodded slowly. You need help. There's men in town who owe you. You brought down 3 elk last winter, shared the meat when supplies were low. Folks remember that. I appreciate it, but this is my problem. Your choice. Pike paused. But Reed, you should know, before Cutler left, he was asking about you specifically, about your past. Someone told him you were a soldier. Jonas felt ice in his veins.
They say anything else?
Just that you had a reputation during the war, that you were someone to be careful of. Pike's eyes narrowed. Is it true? Were you one of those ghost riders? The ones who did the secret work? Jonas didn't answer directly. If Cutler knows about that, he'll either stay away or come prepared. Or come for the bounty, Pike said quietly. There's still paper out on some of those ghost units. Men who did things the government doesn't want to acknowledge. Jonas's jaw clenched. He'd known this could happen eventually, that his past might catch up with him. But he'd hoped for more time. I need to get back, then ride fast. Pike pushed a bottle across the bar. Take this. You'll need it for what's coming. Jonas grabbed the bottle, his supplies, and was mounted within minutes. But as he rode out of town, a figure stepped from the alley beside the saloon. A young man Jonas didn't recognize, watching him with sharp eyes before disappearing into the shadows. The ride back was punishing. Jonas pushed the mules harder than he should have, his mind churning with worst-case scenarios. 3 days felt like an eternity when Cutler and his men were out there, potentially closing in on the cabin. On the 2nd day, riding through a narrow pass, Jonas spotted something that made him rein up short. Horse tracks, recent, heading north toward his valley. 4 riders moving together. The tracks were maybe 6 hours old. His blood ran cold. He abandoned caution and urged the mules to a dangerous pace, cutting across rough terrain to save time. By late afternoon of the 3rd day, he was approaching his valley from the eastern ridge, coming in high where he could see the cabin before he was spotted. What he saw made his heart stop. 4 horses tied at the edge of his property, smoke rising from his chimney. And standing on his porch, rifle in hand, and a confident sneer on his scarred face, was Silas Cutler. Jonas dismounted, left the mules hidden in the trees, and moved closer on foot. Using every skill he'd learned during the war, he could hear voices now, Cutler's rough laugh carrying across the distance. "Come on out, ladies," Cutler called toward the cabin door. "We know you're in there. Your friend Reed ain't here to protect you. We saw him leave 3 days ago. They'd been watching, waiting for him to leave Martha and Clara alone." Jonas worked his way closer, using the cover of boulders and brush. He could see the cabin door was barred from inside. Martha and Clara had locked themselves in. Smart. But the cabin wasn't built to withstand a siege. "Last chance," Cutler shouted. "Come out peaceful or we burn you out." "Your choice." One of Cutler's men, a lean fellow with a cruel face, was already gathering kindling and dry branches. They were serious about the threat. Jonas was calculating angles, counting bullets, assessing odds, when Cutler said something that changed everything. "Hey, Reed." Cutler suddenly called out, though he was still facing the cabin. "I know you're out there. Saw your tracks coming in from the East Ridge. You were always good at sneaking, but I've been hunting men for 20 years. Jonas froze. How had Cutler known? "Come on down and let's talk like civilized folks," Cutler continued. "I've got a business proposition for you. See, I've been doing some research since we last met. Learned some interesting things about Jonas Reed, or should I say, he turned, looked directly at where Jonas was hidden, and smiled. Jonas Ghost Reed, formerly of the 4th Irregular Cavalry, Confederate guerrilla unit. The man they said couldn't be caught, couldn't be killed. Jonas's past, laid bare in front of Martha and Clara. The things he'd done, the man he'd been. There's still bounty on you, Ghost, Cutler said conversationally. $5,000 dead or alive. Federal government's real interested in finding all you boys who did their dirty work and then disappeared. He paused for effect. Now I'm a businessman, so here's my offer. You come down, turn yourself in peaceful, and I let the women go. Or you stay hidden, and I take all 3 of you. The women to sell to a friend of mine who runs a house in San Francisco, and you to collect that bounty. Jonas felt his world tilt. Everything he'd built, the peace he'd found, the future he'd started to believe in, all of it crashing down because of who he'd been 2 decades ago. But then he heard Martha's voice, muffled through the cabin door. Jonas Reed, if you're out there, don't you dare give yourself up for us. And Clara, younger and fiercer, we didn't ask for a martyr. We asked for a father. Something in Jonas broke open. Not broke apart, but broke open, like a shell cracking to release what had been dormant inside. He stood up from his hiding place, rifle in hand, and walked into the clearing. Not with the resignation of a man defeated, but with the cold certainty of a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. You're right. Cutler, Jonas said, his voice carrying across the distance. I was Ghost, still am, I suppose. Which means you've made a serious mistake. Cutler's smile faltered. How's that? You cornered a ghost, threatened his family, and gave him time to prepare. Jonas smiled then, and it wasn't a kind smile. That's 3 tactical errors. Fatal ones? 4 against 1, old man, Cutler said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. I don't care what you used to be. Then let me remind you. Jonas's voice dropped, became something else, the voice of a man who'd hunted and been hunted in the darkest days of the war. I was called Ghost for a reason. Men who came after me didn't come back. Armies that tried to find me found empty camps and their own scouts dead in the night. I wasn't the best because I was fastest or strongest. He paused. I was the best because I was patient and smart, and because I never ever left witnesses. The clearing went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Jonas added, almost conversationally, and because I always have a backup plan. On cue, gunshots rang out from 2 different directions, not aimed at anyone, just warning shots. Cutler and his men spun, trying to cover multiple angles at once. Jonas had worked with ghosts before, had called in favors when he'd reached town, knowing that Pike would spread the word to the right people. Men who owed Jonas their lives or their livelihoods. Men who'd followed him through a war and would follow him through this. You're surrounded, Jonas said calmly. By at least 6 rifles, probably more. Every escape route has a shooter. Every boulder might hide a friend of mine. He let that sink in. So here's my counter-proposal. You ride out now, you live. You stay, you die. Simple as that. Cutler's face went red with rage and fear. You're bluffing. Test me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of Cutler's men, the one who'd been gathering kindling, dropped the wood and moved toward the horses. Ain't worth it, Silas. Ain't worth dying over. Stay where you are. Cutler snarled, but another man was already following the first toward the horses. Cutler raised his rifle toward Jonas, desperation overriding sense. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from the trees. Kicking up dirt at Cutler's feet. Next one's through your skull, called a voice Jonas recognized. Pike. From town, keeping his promise. Cutler lowered the rifle. His face twisted with hate and humiliation, but he was beaten, and he knew it. This ain't over, Reed. Yes, Jonas said quietly. It is. You come back, you die. You send men after us, they die. You even think about these women again. His voice went colder than the Wyoming winter. And I'll hunt you through every territory from here to California. Ghost's promise. Cutler mounted his horse. His men were already riding hard out of the valley. With one last venomous look, he followed. Jonas waited until they were out of sight, then called out, "You can come out now!" Pike emerged from the tree line, rifle over his shoulder, along with two other men Jonas recognized from town. "Figured you could use the help," Pike said with a grin. "And it's been a dull winter. I owe you. Now we're square." Pike glanced at the cabin. "You should probably explain things to your ladies, though. They look mighty confused." The cabin door opened. Martha and Clara stood in the doorway, both holding rifles, both looking at Jonas with expressions he couldn't quite read. Jonas walked toward them, his past laid bare, his secrets exposed. "Knowing that everything had changed, we need to talk," he said quietly. Pike and the other men left after accepting coffee and thanks. They'd ride back to town with a warning to spread the word about Cutler, that Jonas Reed's property was under protection, and anyone who troubled it would answer to more than just one man. After they'd gone, Jonas stood in his cabin facing Martha and Clara. The silence stretched heavy between them, filled with questions and revelations that couldn't be ignored. "Ghost," Martha finally said. "That's what he called you." Jonas removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "It was my call sign during the war. The name they gave me in the irregular cavalry." "What did you do?" Clara asked, not accusingly, but needing to know. "What did Ghost do?" Jonas sat down heavily at the table. He'd known this conversation would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time, hoped to ease them into it, to explain in a way that didn't sound like confessing to being a monster. "The war was ugly," he began. "Uglier than most people know. Both sides did things that history books won't talk about. Irregular cavalry. We were guerrillas, scouts, saboteurs. We went behind enemy lines, disrupted supply chains, gathered intelligence." He paused, met their eyes. "And we eliminated targets the regular army couldn't reach." "You killed people," Martha said quietly. "Yes." Jonas wouldn't lie to her, wouldn't dress it up. Officers, couriers, sometimes civilians who were feeding information to the other side. I was good at it, too good. They called me Ghost because I could get in and out without being seen. Men would be alive at sundown and dead by dawn, and no one would know how it happened. Clara sat down across from him. "How many?" "I stopped counting after the first year." Jonas's voice was hollow. "Maybe 50, maybe more. I told myself it was war, that I was following orders, that it was them or us. And maybe that was true. But it doesn't change what I did." Martha moved to the window, looked out at the valley. Her back was to Jonas, her posture rigid. "Is there really a bounty on you?" "There was. Maybe still is." Jonas explained about the irregular units, how after the war the government had wanted to distance itself from their actions. They offered amnesty to most soldiers, but not to us. We knew too much, had done too much. Some of us were quietly pardoned. Others weren't. I never found out which category I fell into, so I disappeared. "For 17 years, Martha said, still facing the window. "You've been hiding for 17 years. "Not hiding," Jonas corrected gently. "Living quietly." "There's a difference." Martha turned then, and her face was complicated, not angry but troubled, thoughtful. "That man, Cutler. You bluffed him. Those backup shooters were real," Jonas interrupted. "Pike and 2 others from town. I sent word when I was there, asked them to watch the valley while I was gone. Good men who owed me favors. But you made it sound like an army. I made it sound like enough to make Cutler think twice." Jonas stood, needed to move. "I learned a long time ago that most fights can be won before the first shot is fired. It's about controlling the narrative, making your enemy believe they've already lost. Psychological warfare," Clara said softly. "I read about that in a book once." Jonas nodded. "Exactly that." Martha crossed to the table, sat down beside Clara. Mother and daughter exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. Then Martha looked at Jonas with eyes that had seen too much of the world to be easily shocked. "Are you still that man?" she asked. "The ghost?" It was the question Jonas had been asking himself for 17 years. The question he'd thought he'd answered by building this cabin, by living alone, by trying to become someone different. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I thought I'd left him behind. But when Cutler threatened you, when I thought about what he might do..." He stopped, struggling for words. "Something woke up. Something I thought was dead. You were willing to kill for us," Clara said. Not a question, just a statement. Yes. Would you have? Without hesitation, the admission hung in the air. Jonas waited for judgment, for fear, for them to ask him to take them to town as soon as possible. He wouldn't blame them. He'd brought danger to their doorstep, revealed himself to be something other than the simple mountain man they'd thought him to be. Martha stood, walked around the table, and did something Jonas didn't expect. She took his weathered, scarred hands in hers. "Thank you," she said simply. Jonas blinked. "For what?" "For being willing to protect us. For calling in those favors. For standing between us and men who would have hurt us." She squeezed his hands. "You ask if you're still Ghost? Maybe you are? But Ghost just saved 2 women's lives without firing a single shot. That doesn't sound like a monster to me." "I've done terrible things," Jonas whispered. "We've all done things we're not proud of." Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "War makes people into things they're not. Survival does too. What matters is who you choose to be now, today, when you have a choice." Clara came over, put her hand on Jonas's shoulder. "You could have let Cutler take you. Could have traded yourself for us. But you didn't. You fought for us. For this." She gestured at the cabin, at the 3 of them. "That's not the action of a man who's just hiding from his past. That's the action of a man who's found something worth protecting." Jonas felt something break inside him. Not snap, but soften, the rigid control he'd maintained for so long finally giving way. His eyes burned with tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. "I don't deserve you," he said roughly. "Either of you." "That's not your decision," Martha replied. "We choose to stay." "We choose you, despite your past, because of your present, and hoping for our future." She paused, then added softly, "Jonas Reed, whoever you were during the war, I know who you are now. You're a good man who's been alone too long. A man who opened his door when he could have kept it closed. A man who's given us safety and hope and the beginning of a home." "She's right," Clara added. "And for what it's worth, my papa, Thomas, he was in the war too. He never talked about it much, but sometimes I'd hear him crying in his sleep. Mama would hold him until he stopped. Whatever he did over there, it haunted him. But it didn't make him a bad man. It made him a man who'd survived something terrible and was trying to be good in spite of it." Jonas looked at them both, these women who'd stumbled into his life by accident and changed everything. Who'd seen him at his worst, learned his darkest secrets, and were choosing to stay anyway. "Cutler won't stop," he said, needing them to understand the reality. "He might not come back himself, but he's got connections. Word will spread that there's a bounty on me. Others might try, then we'll be ready," Martha said firmly. "We'll prepare, we'll train, we'll do whatever it takes. But we're not running, and we're not giving up what we've built here." Over the next few days, Jonas taught them everything he knew about defense and survival. Not the brutal skills of Ghost, but the practical knowledge of a man who'd spent a lifetime staying alive in hostile territory. He showed them how to read tracks, how to spot signs of intruders, taught them to shoot, not just adequately, but well, until Clara could hit a target at 50 yards and Martha could reload a rifle in seconds. They practiced defensive positions, escape routes, signals, but he also showed them other things. How to preserve food for a siege, how to reinforce the cabin's weak points, how to cache supplies in hidden locations, practical preparations that would serve them whether danger came or not. In the evenings, they talked. Jonas told them stories from before the war, his childhood, his family, the dreams he'd had before violence reshaped his world. Martha shared more about Thomas, about Clara's real father, about the generations of strong women she came from. Clara drew portraits of all of them, capturing not just faces but moments. Jonas teaching her to shoot, Martha cooking by firelight, the 3 of them sitting together on the porch, watching the sunset. One evening, as they worked on strengthening the cabin's shutters, Martha pulled out her recipe box. "I want you to have this," she said to Jonas. "Martha, I can't, not forever. Just hold on to it. Keep it safe." She touched the worn tin gently. "These recipes, they've survived fire and flood and bandits. They're the one thing I managed to protect through everything. And now I'm trusting you to protect them. To protect us." Jonas took the box with reverent hands. Inside were cards spanning generations, recipes written in different hands, each one a piece of history, a link to family and continuity. He understood what Martha was really giving him, not just recipes, but trust. A piece of her heart to hold. "I won't let anything happen to them," he promised. "Or to you." That night Jonas couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire long after Martha and Clara had gone to bed, holding the silver locket he'd given Martha, Elizabeth's locket, which Martha had quietly returned to him that afternoon. "I think you should give this to her again," Martha had said. "When you're ready. When you've decided what you really want, what he really wanted." Jonas turned the locket over in his hands, opened it to see Elizabeth's faded portrait, baby Samuel's tiny face beside hers. For years, looking at these faces had meant pain and regret. But tonight, for the first time, he felt something else too, gratitude. Gratitude for the time he'd had, for the love he'd known. And beneath that something new, permission. Elizabeth staring out from the locket with her kind eyes, and Jonas could almost hear her voice. "Don't waste the rest of your life grieving me. Live, Jonas. Love again. Be happy." He thought about Martha's hand in his, about Clara calling him a father, about the way the cabin felt with their presence, not haunted by Elizabeth's absence, but graced by Martha's company. Two different women, two different loves, both real, both valuable. The past didn't have to be erased to honor the present. He could carry Elizabeth in his heart and still have room for Martha. Could remember his son and still be a father to Clara. Jonas closed the locket, held it over his heart. Tomorrow he would give it to Martha again, properly this time. Would ask her the question he should have asked already. Would claim the future he'd stopped believing in. But tonight he sat with his ghosts, the literal ones from his past and the figurative ghost he'd been. Sat with them and made his peace, thanked them for teaching him what they had, and said goodbye. When dawn came, Jonas Reed would wake as someone new. Not ghost, not the broken widower, but simply a man who'd been given a second chance and was brave enough to take it. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, covering the valley in white. Inside, 3 people slept peacefully, dreaming of spring. The attack came on a morning 2 weeks later, just when they'd started to believe the danger had passed. Jonas woke to absolute silence, the kind of silence that sets a soldier's instincts screaming. No birds, no wind. Even the creek seemed to have gone quiet. He was out of bed in seconds, rifle in hand, moving to the window. 4 riders approaching from the south, moving carefully, using the tree cover. Not Cutler. Jonas would have recognized his posture, his horse. These were different men, professionals by the way they moved. Bounty hunters. Jonas's hand went instinctively to his vest pocket, feeling for the watch over his heart. It ticked steadily, marking seconds that suddenly felt precious. He'd wound it every day since that night by the fire, a promise to himself to keep living, to keep moving forward. Now that promise was being tested, Martha, he said quietly, not taking his eyes from the window. "Clara, wake up. We've got company." They were up instantly, no questions, moving to their prepared positions. Clara to the east window with the spare rifle, Martha to the west with the pistol. Jonas stayed at the south-facing door, watching the riders approach. They stopped just outside rifle range, spread out in a tactical formation. Jonas recognized the pattern. These men had military training. One of them called out, his voice carrying across the cold morning air, "Jonas Reed! We know you're in there. We're not here to hurt anyone. We just want to talk. A talking's done from where you are." Jonas called back, "State your business or ride on." A pause. Then, "We represent certain interests in Washington. There's a standing warrant for your arrest, but we're authorized to offer terms." Washington, federal government. They'd finally tracked him down. Martha moved closer to Jonas, her face pale but determined. "What do we do?" Jonas's mind raced through options. 4 armed men, all trained. He could probably take 2 before they reached cover, but the other 2 would pin them down. And if there were more waiting in reserve? What terms? Jonas shouted. "You come in peaceful. Testify about your unit's operations during the war. Government wants to close the books on certain activities. You cooperate, they'll commute your sentence. You'll do time, but not hang." Jonas felt Martha's hand on his arm. They're offering you a deal that ends with me in prison." Jonas's voice was bitter. "Probably for years, but alive," Clara added from her position. "That's better than dead." The lead writer called out again. "You've got 5 minutes to decide, Reed. Then we come in and take you by force. And anyone who gets in our way becomes an accessory." Jonas looked at Martha and Clara, these women who'd become his family, his purpose, his reason for winding the watch each morning. The thought of leaving them, of spending years behind bars while they struggled alone, was almost physically painful. But the alternative was a gunfight. And even if he won, more would come. The federal government had resources he couldn't match. He could run, but he'd spend the rest of his life running. And he'd drag Martha and Clara into that life, always looking over their shoulders, always moving, never safe, unless— "I need to try something," Jonas said quietly. "It might not work, but if it does, we might all walk away from this." "What are you thinking?" Martha asked. Jonas moved to his old trunk, the one he'd kept locked for years. Inside were documents, letters, orders, records from the war he'd kept as insurance. Evidence of things the government had ordered done, but would never admit to publicly. "Leverage," he said, holding up the papers. "Names, dates, operations. Things that would embarrass powerful men if they became public." "You kept records," Clara breathed. "All this time, old habit. Never destroy evidence that might save your life." Jonas moved back to the door. "I'm going to make them a counteroffer," he called out. "I've got documents, records of every operation my unit conducted, every order we received, names of officers who gave those orders. Some of them are senators now, cabinet members. You take me in, those documents go public." Silence from outside. Jonas could almost hear the riders conferring. Finally, "You're bluffing." "Test me!" Jonas shouted back. "I've got papers here dated and signed, proof of things your government did and then tried to bury. I kept them because I knew someday someone might come for me, and I made sure copies exist in other locations." "Multiple locations? You kill me, they get released automatically." Another long pause. "Then let me contact my superiors." "You've got 5 minutes," Jonas replied, throwing their own deadline back at them. "Then I assume your answer is no. And I burn these papers while you explain to Washington why you couldn't secure the evidence." Martha gripped his arm. "Do you really have copies hidden?" "No," Jonas admitted. "But they don't know that. You're gambling everything on a bluff," Clara said. "Not everything." Jonas looked at them both. Everything would be giving up. "This is fighting smart." The minutes stretched. Jonas watched the riders, saw one of them pull out what looked like a small mirror, signaling someone in the distance. "Back up, probably." This was about to get more complicated. Then the lead rider called out again, "Reed, my superiors want proof you have what you claim. Bring one document out. We'll verify it." Jonas smiled grimly. "Not a chance. You verify it, then you've got no reason to negotiate. Here's my counteroffer. Full pardon for all war-related activities. In writing. Signed by someone with authority. You get that, I'll hand over half the documents. The other half stays hidden as insurance." "That's not how this works." "That's exactly how this works." Jonas replied, "You want this buried, you meet my terms. Otherwise, every newspaper from here to New York gets a package full of very interesting reading material." He was betting everything on the government wanting this quiet more than they wanted him in chains. Betting that the embarrassment of revealed secrets was worse than letting one old soldier go free. The watch in his pocket ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt like hours. Then, incredibly, the lead rider lowered his rifle. "All right, Reed. We'll take it up the chain. But this isn't over. We'll be back with a decision." "I'll be here," Jonas called. "But make it fast. My patience has limits." The riders withdrew, moving back down the valley. Jonas didn't relax until they were out of sight, and even then his muscles stayed coiled tight. "Did that just work?" Clara asked incredulously. "Maybe," Jonas said. "Or maybe they're regrouping for an assault." But Martha was smiling, fierce and proud. "You just blackmailed the federal government." "I learned from the best," Jonas replied. Ghost wasn't just about fighting. It was about winning, and for the first time since this started, Jonas thought they might actually do just that. 3 days of waiting. 3 days of watching the valley, taking turns on watch, jumping at every sound. The tension was exhausting, wearing them all down despite their determination to stay strong. On the morning of the 4th day, a single rider appeared. He carried a white flag and rode slowly, hands visible, making it clear he was no threat. Jonas watched through his spyglass, an older man well-dressed riding a good horse. Not military, government official maybe. I'm coming out, Jonas told Martha and Clara. If anything happens, we know, Martha interrupted. We run, we hide, we survive. You've told us 100 times. She touched his face gently. But nothing's going to happen. This is going to work. Jonas wanted to believe her. He strapped on his gun belt, picked up his rifle, and walked out to meet the rider halfway between the cabin and the tree line. The man dismounted when Jonas approached. He was in his 60s, grey-haired and distinguished, with the bearing of someone used to authority. Mr. Reed, I'm Samuel Morrison, Special Counsel to the Attorney General. I've been authorized to negotiate terms. Negotiate, Jonas repeated, not demand. Your leverage is acknowledged. Morrison pulled papers from his saddlebag. I've reviewed the records from your unit. What you claim to have would indeed be problematic if released. So, you're here to make a deal. I'm here to resolve this situation in a way that serves everyone's interests. Morrison spread the papers on a flat rock. Full pardon for all actions committed under military orders during the war. Immunity from prosecution. All warrants void. Jonas examined the documents. They looked official, bore impressive seals and signatures. In exchange for? The documents you claim to possess. All copies. And your silence. My silence. You don't speak publicly about your wartime service. You don't write a memoir. You continue living quietly as you have been. Morrison paused. The government has no interest in punishing you, Mr. Reed, but neither can it allow certain operations to become public knowledge. Too many reputations at stake, too many political complications. Jonas thought about the papers in his cabin, damning evidence of orders given, atrocities authorized, politicians' hands stained with blood they'd tried to wash clean. The government wanted them buried, and they'd pay handsomely for the burial. How do I know you'll honor this? Jonas asked. Once you have the documents, what's to stop you from arresting me anyway? Morrison met his eyes levelly. My word. And the fact that you're not stupid enough to give me all the copies. You'll keep insurance, and we'll maintain plausible deniability about its existence. Mutually assured destruction, Mr. Reed. The Cold War being fought in a Wyoming valley. Jonas almost smiled. Morrison was smart, understood the game. And Cutler? The bounty hunters. Cutler has been informed that any further action against you will result in federal prosecution. The bounty has been withdrawn. You're under government protection now, not as an informant, but as someone whose continued well-being serves national security interests. Fancy way of saying you need me quiet and alive? Precisely. Morrison pulled out a pen. Sign here and this is done. You go back to your life. The government goes back to pretending none of this ever happened. Everyone wins. Jonas looked back at the cabin, where Martha and Clara stood watching from the porch. 2 women who'd come into his life by accident and become his reason for negotiating instead of fighting. He thought about the future they could have. Peaceful, simple, safe. He signed the papers. Morrison countersigned, folded his set carefully. The documents? Half now, Jonas said. Per our agreement. The rest stay hidden. Insurance. Agreed. Morrison waited while Jonas retrieved a portion of the papers from the cabin. He examined them, nodded satisfaction. These will be destroyed immediately. I'm sure they will. Morrison mounted his horse, then paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Reed, I read your file. What you did during the war, it was brutal, yes. But you followed orders, protected your men, and achieved objectives that saved lives in the long run. The Ghost may have killed, but he also prevented larger massacres. That counts for something, does it? I think so. Morrison settled in his saddle. The war's over. You've earned your peace. Enjoy it. He rode away, taking his papers and his promises with him. Jonas stood watching until he disappeared, then walked back to the cabin. Martha and Clara met him at the door. "Is it over?" Clara asked. Jonas pulled out the pardon documents, showed them the official seals, the signatures that made him a free man. "It's over." Martha's legs seemed to give out. She sat down hard on the porch step, her hand over her mouth. When she looked up, tears streamed down her face, not of sadness, but of relief so profound it overwhelmed her composure. Clara knelt beside her mother, wrapped her arms around her. They held each other and cried while Jonas stood above them, feeling emotions he couldn't name swirling through his chest. He'd won, not through violence, not through ghosts' lethal skills, but through strategy and leverage and sheer stubborn refusal to give up what mattered. He pulled the pocket watch from his vest, looked at its steady ticking. Time moving forward. A future opening up where before there'd been only shadows and uncertainty. Jonas knelt down, put his arms around both women. They held each other on that porch, 3 people who'd each lost everything and somehow found each other. 3 people who'd fought for a chance at happiness and won. "It's really over," Martha whispered. "It's really over," Jonas confirmed. "Now we can finally start living." Above them, the Wyoming sky stretched endless and blue. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent as they always had. But in this small valley, in this weathered cabin, something had changed. Ghost had finally been laid to rest. And Jonas Reed, just a man now, was finally free to be whoever he chose to be. He chose to be home. Spring came to the Wyoming high country the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once. The snow melted into rushing creeks, the valley floor turned green, and wildflowers pushed through the still cold earth with stubborn determination. Jonas stood on the porch, watching the morning sun paint the peaks gold and pink. Behind him, he could hear Martha humming as she prepared breakfast, could smell coffee and bacon and fresh bread. Clara was already outside, tending the garden they'd expanded together, her hands in the soil, coaxing life from the earth. 3 months since the government men had ridden away. 3 months of peace so complete it sometimes felt unreal. Jonas kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for new threats to emerge. But slowly, day by quiet day, he was learning to accept that maybe, just maybe, the danger really was past. "Morning," Martha said, stepping out beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and stood close, their shoulders touching in companionable silence. "Morning," Jonas replied. He'd learned the comfort of not needing to fill every silence with words. Sometimes just being together was enough. "Clara wants to ride into town today," Martha said. "She's been working on sketches to sell. Thinks the general store might display them for travelers. She's talented enough." Jonas sipped his coffee, and Pike mentioned a school teacher passed through last month, young fellow from back east, saw Clara's drawings and asked about her. Martha gave him a knowing look. Did he now? Clara's young. She deserves a chance at a future. Maybe one that includes someone her own age. "And what about her mother?" Martha asked, her tone carefully casual. "What kind of future does she deserve?" Jonas set down his coffee cup. He'd been carrying something in his pocket for weeks now, waiting for the right moment. He'd learned, from experience, that there was no perfect time. You just had to be brave enough to seize the moment you had. He pulled out Elizabeth's locket, the one he'd given Martha once before and she'd returned. He opened it, showed her the faded portraits inside. "I loved them," he said quietly. "Elizabeth and Samuel. They were my whole world. When they died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, and I was mostly okay with that. Jonas, let me finish." He closed the locket, held it in his palm. "I was wrong. About a lot of things, about thinking the past has to define the future, about believing there's only one chance at love in a lifetime." He looked at her directly. "You and Clara, you've given me something I thought was gone forever. You've given me a reason to wake up excited about the day, a reason to plan beyond just surviving the next winter." Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "This locket," Jonas continued, "I gave it to you before, then you gave it back. Said I should give it to you again when I was ready, when I'd decided what I really wanted." He took her hand, pressed the locket into her palm. "I'm ready now. I want you to have it. not as a replacement for Elizabeth, but as a symbol of what we're building, past and present together, loss and hope together. Jonas Reed, Martha whispered, are you proposing to me? I'm asking you to stay, really stay, not as a guest, not temporarily, but as my wife, as Clara's stepfather, as a family. He paused, then added with a slight smile, unless you think you can do better than a reformed outlaw living in a mountain cabin. Martha laughed through her tears. Better? I spent 8 months thinking I'd never feel whole again, never feel safe or wanted or loved. Then I knocked on your door and you let us in. You fed us, protected us, gave us a home when we had nothing. She opened the locket, looked at the portraits inside. I think Elizabeth would approve. I think she would too. Then yes, Martha said firmly. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, we'll stay. Yes, to all of it. They stood there holding each other as the sun climbed higher and the valley came fully alive around them. Eventually, Clara noticed them from the garden and came running. Mama? Jonas? Everything all right? Martha held up the locket and understanding dawned on Clara's face. Oh, this is your... She couldn't seem to finish a sentence, just threw her arms around both of them. We're getting married, Martha confirmed. If that's all right with you. All right, it's perfect. Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes. Can I draw the wedding? And the ceremony? I want to capture everything. You can draw whatever you want, Jonas said. This is your home too. Your family too. That afternoon, they walked together to the spot where Jonas had buried the first cornerstone, the one carved with his and Elizabeth's initials. Clara had carved a new stone, as she'd mentioned weeks ago, with all 3 of their initials. Together they placed it beside the original. 2 stones, Martha said softly. 2 families, 1 home. Jonas looked at the stones side by side, past and present acknowledging each other. Elizabeth told me once that love doesn't divide, it multiplies. I didn't understand what she meant then, and now I think I do. Jonas took Martha's hand. Loving you doesn't mean I loved her less. It means my heart learned to grow. They stood there as the afternoon shadows lengthened, 3 people, who'd each known loss and loneliness, who'd found each other through chance and need and chosen to become something more. That evening, as was their custom now, they sat together on the porch. Clara sketched the valley in the fading light. Martha worked on her recipe cards, adding new ones she'd created here in this cabin. Jonas whittled a piece of wood, shaping it slowly into something that might become a toy for future grandchildren. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney, not the lonely smoke of a hermit's fire, but the warm smoke of a family hearth. Inside, Martha's recipe box sat beside Jonas's war medals. Clara's drawings covered the walls beside Jonas's old hunting knife. Symbols of separate lives now woven together into something new. The valley settled into evening quiet. The mountains stood eternal, witnesses to one more human story of loss and redemption, loneliness and connection, fear and courage. Jonas reached into his pocket, felt the steady tick-tick-tick of his watch. Time moving forward, marking seconds of a life he'd stopped believing could be this full, this rich, this worth living. He thought about that cold evening months ago when a desperate widow had asked, "Can we stay tonight?" He thought about his hesitation, his almost refusal, how close he'd come to turning them away. And he thought about how a single moment of compassion had changed everything, had transformed a cabin into a home, a hermit into a husband and father, survivors into a family. "What are you thinking about?" Martha asked, noticing his distant expression. Jonas looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd walked into his life with nothing and given him everything. Looked at Clara, already becoming the daughter he'd never dared hope to have again. Looked at the valley and the cabin and the life they were building together. "I'm thinking," he said quietly, "that some prayers get answered even when you've forgotten how to pray." Martha leaned her head against his shoulder. Clara continued sketching, capturing this moment to preserve forever. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, countless and cold and distant. But here, in this small valley, in this weathered cabin, there was warmth enough for all. There was warmth enough for always, and Jonas Reed, who'd spent 12 years speaking to the wind, had finally learned to speak the language of home.